Story 1: The Haunted Mansion of Pennsylvania. It was the winter of 2014 when Mark, a seasoned ghost hunter, decided to investigate an abandoned mansion located in a small, quiet town in Pennsylvania. The mansion, once the home of a wealthy family, had fallen into disrepair over the years after a tragic series of events that caused the family to disappear without a trace. Locals whispered of strange happenings around the mansion, suggesting it was haunted. Some claimed the family had met with a tragic end. Others said it was more than that the house itself had a life of its own. Mark, being a skeptic, had always brushed off such rumors. He didn't believe in ghosts, not truly. He was a man of science, someone who had spent years studying the paranormal with a logical, methodical approach. However, even he couldn't deny that there was something undeniably eerie about the house when he drove up to it that afternoon. The mansion loomed in the distance, its outline obscured by a thick blanket of mist that swirled around the base of the structure. It was the kind of house you'd see in a horror movie, a towering Gothic figure, standing tall in a field of overgrown weeds, the windows dark like empty eyes. As he approached, the iron gates creaked in the wind, and the large mansion came into view. Mark felt an unexpected twinge of unease in his stomach, but he quickly dismissed it. He parked his car near the crumbling entrance, grabbed his gear, and stepped out into the cold. The air was biting, and his breath formed visible clouds with every exhale. The mansion's front door was slightly ajar. Mark pushed it open, the heavy wood groaning in protest. The inside was like stepping into another time, a world frozen in decay. Dust hung thick in the air, and the floorboards creaked beneath his weight. He made his way deeper into the house, setting up his cameras, motion detectors, and audio equipment as he went. Every room felt more oppressive than the last, dimly lit, musty, with tattered furniture left as though the occupants had simply vanished in the middle of their lives. For hours, Mark explored the house, but nothing unusual happened. No strange sounds, no cold spots, nothing to indicate that this place was anything more than a long-forgotten relic of the past. He began to grow frustrated. He was about to pack up when he decided to check out the second floor. Perhaps he would have better luck there. As he climbed the winding staircase, a strange coldness began to settle in. It wasn't just the temperature. It felt like something was pressing in on him, like a heavy weight was starting to settle around him. He turned a corner and entered the hallway on the second floor. The door at the end of the corridor stood slightly ajar. Without thinking, Mark moved toward it. Inside was a large drawing room. The wallpaper was peeling, and the once grand furniture was covered in white sheets. There was a large fireplace at the far end of the room, and everything felt unsettlingly still. As he stepped inside, the temperature dropped even further. Mark's breath fogged in the air. It was colder than it should have been. He checked his thermometer. There was a drastic drop of nearly 15 degrees. A whisper broke the silence. Mark froze, his heart thundering in his chest. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A voice, soft but clear. "Mark! Mark!" Mark's pulse quickened. He spun around, searching for the source, but saw nothing. He rushed to check his equipment. Everything appeared to be working. The whisper came again, this time louder. "Mark! Come closer!" Something was wrong. Mark had been on many ghost hunts, but he had never felt such a thick, oppressive presence before. The voice was compelling him, urging him to move forward. Against his better judgment, he began to walk toward the fireplace. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a figure. A woman, pale and gaunt, standing by the window. Her dress was old-fashioned, flowing in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Her face was obscured by dark, unkempt hair, and her eyes glowed a sickly pale blue. Mark's stomach dropped. He stepped forward, trying to get a closer look, but as soon as he reached the center of the room, she vanished. Just like that, she was gone. Mark blinked, his mouth dry. He turned back toward the fireplace, his heart racing in his chest. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more frantic. The room seemed to close in on him. The air grew thick, and Mark felt something cold brush against the back of his neck, a breath that wasn't his own. It was almost as if the room itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with energy. The sensation was suffocating. Panic overtook him. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. Mark jerked backward, stumbling as the room seemed to spin. The whispers surrounded him, filling his ears with unintelligible murmurs. He tried to open the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. Sweat poured down his face as the temperature continued to plummet. His motion detectors went off, the lights flashing erratically as if something was moving around him. Desperate to escape, Mark tried to break the door open. His hand trembled as he forced it, but it wouldn't give way. The whispers began to form words, clear now, frantic and angry. "Leave! Now!" Mark's heart was pounding in his chest. He backed away from the door, his eyes frantically scanning the room. Then, in the far corner, he saw her again. This time standing in the shadows. Her face was twisted in a grotesque smile, her eyes black and hollow. Her mouth moved as if she was speaking, but no words came out. In sheer panic, Mark ran toward the window, desperate for any escape. He managed to pry it open, throwing himself into the cold night air, his legs unsteady as he fell to the ground outside. The whispers faded as he scrambled to his feet and ran back to his car, never once looking back at the mansion. To this day, Mark can't explain what happened that night. But he swears that something in that house didn't want him to leave, and whatever it was, it's still there, waiting for its next victim. Story 2: The Bizarre Incident at the Bed and Breakfast. In the spring of 2017, Jenny and her friends embarked on a road trip to the quiet, picturesque town of Derry, Maine. The town had a certain charm, with its cobblestone streets and colonial-era buildings. They were intrigued by its history but mostly drawn to its small-town allure. Jenny, however, had never been one for ghost stories. She was always the skeptic, the one who rolled her eyes when anyone brought up paranormal activities. Still, there was something about Derry that made her uneasy. They stayed at a small, old bed and breakfast run by an elderly couple. The house was quaint, with creaky floors and old furniture. The couple was friendly, but there was an odd tension in the air. They always seemed eager to offer help but were incredibly vague when asked about the house's history. Jenny's friends laughed it off, joking that the house was haunted. Jenny, dismissing it as typical ghost story fodder, wasn't concerned in the slightest. That night, after dinner, Jenny went to bed in the room at the far end of the hallway. The room was dim, illuminated only by the faint light of the street lamp outside. As Jenny lay under the covers, she noticed a coldness in the room, colder than it should have been. The window was slightly cracked, but it didn't explain the chill that settled around her. She brushed it off, thinking it was just the old house. But then, she began to hear something. A soft scratching sound. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, but it steadily grew louder. Jenny sat up, heart racing, as the noise continued. It sounded as though something was dragging across the floor. She looked around the room, scanning every corner. The sound came again, closer this time. It was unmistakable, like nails on a chalkboard, scraping against the floor. Jenny's breath hitched as she turned her head toward the source of the sound. There, in the corner of the room, something was moving, just barely perceptible, but it was there. She squinted in the darkness, trying to make out what it was. Then, she heard the voice. A soft whisper, barely audible but distinct. "Leave!" Jenny's blood ran cold. She quickly jumped out of bed, her mind racing. She went to the door, only to find it wouldn't open. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tugged at the knob, but the door was stuck, as if something were holding it shut from the other side. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Leave, or you'll never leave." Terrified, Jenny backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room. She could feel something, or someone, watching her. The air grew heavier, suffocating. She spun around, but there was nothing, just shadows, stretching unnaturally across the walls. Suddenly, the door flew open with a force that nearly knocked her over. Jenny bolted into the hallway, gasping for air. Her friends were already standing outside her room, asking if she was okay. She tried to explain what had just happened, but the words wouldn't come. They laughed it off, thinking she had a nightmare. Jenny wasn't so sure. Story 3: The Farmhouse That Wanted Them Gone. Sarah had always been excited about moving into her new farmhouse with her husband, Ben. The place was large and had a beautiful view, and despite the occasional comment from friends about how old the house was, they were both eager to start their new life there. They spent the first few weeks settling in, enjoying the peace and quiet of the country life. But things quickly began to change. It started with strange noises. At first, Sarah thought it was just the house settling. But the noises became more frequent, more distinct. Late at night, she would hear what sounded like footsteps coming from upstairs, even though she knew no one else was home. Ben was away on business at the time, so Sarah was alone in the house. Ben had to go out of town for a work meeting, and she decided to spend the evening catching up on some reading. The house was unusually quiet that evening, the only sound being the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She had just settled into the couch when she heard a loud thump from above. Startled, she froze. The thump came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping noise. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to tell herself it was nothing, perhaps the wind or an animal moving around in the attic. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The noise stopped for a moment, and Sarah held her breath, listening intently. Then, without warning, the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps, one after another. It was as if someone was walking across the floor above her, moving from one room to the next. Sarah's mind raced. She stood up and called out, "Ben?" But there was no answer. Her throat tightened in fear. She grabbed her phone, dialing Ben's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. She hesitated for a moment, then made her way upstairs. The air felt heavier with each step she took, and her heart pounded in her chest. She reached the top of the stairs and stopped. The footsteps had stopped too. The house was eerily still. Sarah glanced around, the hallway ahead of her dimly lit by a faint light from the window. The floor creaked under her feet as she moved cautiously down the hallway. As she reached the first bedroom, she froze. The door was slightly ajar, and there, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure. A tall, shadowy form. She gasped, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. She turned on the lights in the room, but there was no one there. She quickly backed out and ran back downstairs, her pulse racing. The house felt suffocating, its very walls pressing in around her. She felt like she was being watched, and the air was thick with tension. When Ben returned the next day, Sarah told him everything. But he didn't believe her. He chalked it up to stress or imagination. But things only grew worse. The noises continued, and soon, the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. One night, after hearing yet another thump from the attic, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She demanded that Ben leave the house, but he refused. Weeks later, Sarah finally convinced Ben to visit a paranormal investigator. The investigator conducted a thorough examination of the house, and after several hours, he came to a chilling conclusion. The house was haunted by something much darker than they had anticipated. The entity in the house wasn't just a ghost, it was a malevolent presence, one that had attached itself to the farmhouse and didn't want them there. With no other option, they moved out. But to this day, the farmhouse remains vacant. The haunting, it seems, still lingers within those walls.